humildade e honra que me dirijo a todos vocês, como presidente do Brasil.
On January the 1st, Jair Bolsonaro was inaugurated as Brazil's 38th president. The task ahead of him was a true Rubik's Cube, a polarized, deeply unequal country with a sluggish economy, infrastructure deficiencies, low education performance, and fallen investments. Bolsonaro rose from being a long-time backbencher to taking the highest office in the land by capitalizing on Brazilians' frustrations.
Se libertar do socialismo. Se libertar da inversão de valores, do gigantismo estatal e do politicamente correto.
And gambling on an anti-establishment platform. One of his mottos was, "More Brazil, less Brasilia." If that reminds you of Donald Trump's promise to drain the swamp, well, that's the intention. Now, 1/4 of Bolsonaro's term is in the books. So how exactly has he fared so far? That's the question we will address this week. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil. Since re-election was introduced to Brazilian politics in 1997, every single incumbent successfully won a second term. So we know that analyzing a presidency after just 1 year is not a definitive judgment. If the stats are right, there's a lot more Bolsonaro to come. And very few presidents, if any, would have a stellar body of work to show for themselves after only 1 year in office. We know that, for better or worse, President Jair Bolsonaro's legacy is still in the making. Notwithstanding, we produced a free ebook dissecting his performance economically and politically over the past 12 months. You can download the ebook at Brazilian.report. And in this episode, we invited 2 experts, each to discuss one of these 2 domains. We start with Carlos Góes. He is the Chief Research Officer at Instituto Mercado Popular, a São Paulo-based think tank. Previously, Carlos was a researcher for the International Monetary Fund. He is now finishing a Ph.D. at the University of California in San Diego, and he also served as economic advisor for the Michel Temer administration. Carlos, thanks for joining us. When we headed into the runoff stage, it was clear that barring a catastrophe, it was Bolsonaro's election to lose. What did you expect from his presidency, economically speaking?
Well, in a sense, it was a big question mark, right? Because if you think about it, Bolsonaro was traditionally right-wing nationalist, as many right-wing nationalists that took power over the past years. So, like the Brazilian dictatorship that took place between 1964 and 1985, he historically supports a big government that directs economic activity and directs the marketplace towards its strategic interest. That's what the Brazilian military dictatorship did. And he has spent his whole political career defending both the dictatorship and the ideals that are represented by such regime. However, he was alive during this last presidential campaign with Minister Guedes, who is a Chicago-educated economist and who was making, both historically and during the campaign, many pro-market proposals and pro-free market strategies, right? So in a sense, we had this big question mark, and there was this big tension in the government between the nationalists, the military, and the more right-wing ideologues, and the free market economists. So we didn't know exactly what was going to play out. Some people expected Guedes to have superpowers and have a lot of say regarding the economic policy of the government. Some of that materialized, but I think as we're going to get to that later, there are still some parts of economic policymaking in which that tension actually comes about.
So yes, the government is a sort of ideological patchwork. We have the military officers, the president's sons, the libertarian economists, the anti-globalists, big agro, and these groups are not often aligned and sometimes even have conflicting interests. Who has the upper hand after year one?
In what regards economic policy, I think Guedes' team took the lead, and in the most important elements of economic policy making, the Minister of the Economy, led by Minister Guedes, actually took over and, led the government into its path, right? So the biggest challenge was, of course, pension reform. And we can get into that later if you want, but it was something that was ongoing from the previous administration, but that the government decided to face from its first minute, and it managed to go forth and approve a big pension reform. And there are some other challenges such as tax reform, administrative reform, and trade reform that are still ongoing. And I think in different elements of this second round of reforms, there is bigger tension. So in the first moment regarding pension reform, there was such a consensus in the economic team that was the most important challenge facing the administration, that I think the more ideological elements of the government, they stepped aside and let the economists do their job. But there might be some struggles ahead with the other kinds of reforms that Minister Guedes' team has to face. And I think we've seen that in the past. Some proposals for tax reform that were first announced by the economic team and then denounced and decried by President Bolsonaro. And I think in different elements of policymaking, we're going to see that challenge ahead.
The government managed to pass the core point of its agenda against all odds, we could say. The president never developed a true coalition. He depended on Congress to approve the reform and benefited from a change of public perception around the proposal. Until a few years ago, pension reform would be a dirty word. But in 2019, it seemed as if people were on board with it. What changed?
I think this effort for pension reform is something that was an ongoing effort with the previous administration. President Temer's team, and Minister Meirelles, they put a lot of effort into convincing the general public and members of parliament that pension reform was absolutely necessary for the, fiscal soundness of the federal government. And both members of parliament and the general public, they understood that. I think we can see in post-public opinion moving from being against it to being for it. I think part of the communication effort was trying to highlight the fact that especially retired public servants, they had outsized benefits that didn't really match the benefits and the pensions and other benefits, the non-pension benefits as compared to the general public. And that communication effort paid off. I think the Congress also bought the necessity of a pension reform, and I think that's illustrated by the fact that the president of the chairman of the House, he basically, led the whole process of pension reform through Congress, through the lower house, and it went relatively smoothly because a lot of the politicking effort was already being made by the previous administration.
It's interesting you mentioned the Temer administration. I mean, you would know it well, you were there. But the main points of this administration markets have praised are, 1, the pension reform we just talked about, and 2, giving continuity to privatizations kicked off by the Temer administration. So Could we say that the Bolsonaro era is, economically speaking, Temer 2.0?
Well, what I would say, maybe the two words would be continuity matters, right? We've seen that before in Brazil, right? One of the most important positive parts of the first PT administration under President Lula was the fact that the economic policies that were set forth during the Cardoso administration were, they weren't ripped off, but they were rather kept on during the Lula administration. And we all know that the first administration of President Lula was a big economic success in terms of how the government ran the economy back then. And I think we're seeing something similar right now, both in terms of like who stayed in the government. So we know that very competent people like Secretary Mansueto Almeida, who was part of the Temer administration, he's still part of the government right now. And some other people who were very competent and praised people in the Temer administration, they stayed in the government. And I think in terms of policy making, there is a large continuity between the policies set forth under President Temer and the policies that are being pursuing right now. And that's something that is not trivial, and it's something that's important, and it's something that's good, and explains part of the success that we're observing in terms of policy making of the economic team of President Bolsonaro now. So I don't think this is something that we should criticize in the current administration, but rather to recognize the fact that instead of trying to start everything from scratch, they were able to recognize that some very important elements of policy making were already underway, and they could hit the ground running by simply continuing those efforts rather than trying to restart everything from zero.
The Economy Ministry has presented a very bold bill to reshape the Brazilian state. But 2020 is an electoral year in Brazil, and we have municipal elections. Do you think there will be political momentum for the government to continue to approve its agenda?
Well, I think there are many elements to consider here. One, as we said, pension reform was done. That was an important victory for the government, even though it was an ongoing effort from before. I think the three big reforms are had would be the one you just mentioned, public service reform or administrative reform. The other one would be tax reform, and I think there is an ongoing effort in Congress to move forward with tax reform. And the third one would be trade reform. There was some movement in those areas as well in this first year. Tax reform was certainly the biggest failure of this administration. Not only there was diverging opinions between the president and the economic team in public, but the administration didn't even present its plan for tax reform in Congress, and Congress took over this effort to move forward with an independent proposal for tax reform. Trade was initially a big success in the sense that, again, it was an ongoing effort with the Temer administration in trying to sign the free trade deal between Mercosur and the European Union, but there was a stall in the liberalizing and the economy, opening up for trade and lowering tariff barriers. That was an idea for this current administration, and that's mostly because I think the president himself is opposed to the idea of free trade. I'm not sure if because he's being influenced by President Trump, or because he is starting to have some political connections with, the Chamber of Commerce. In Portuguese would be CNI and Fiesp, which are like the business unions, so to speak. And so this will be, so in this sense, this kind of reform will be very hard in an electoral year.
If I asked you to grade the Bolsonaro administration after year one, what would you say?
Certainly not an A+, because even though we have been in this steady but very slow recovery since the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, it is still the slowest recovery that we had. The recovery could have been much faster. there is a feeling that much more could have been done, and it wasn't. So in a sense, it is certainly a disappointment. So certainly not an A, but maybe let's give this administration a B or a B minus for this first year. A B.
Carlos, thank you very much. After the break, we analyze what the president has done on the political front.
Hi, I am Paulo Sotero, Director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center, a renowned think tank based in Washington and a partner of the Brazilian Report. The Brazilian Report is a valuable partner of the Brazil Institute. The report's content, shared in our website, is well-researched, comprehensive, and clearly presented. It deals with complex problems of public policy that challenges Brazil to add quality to its economy and society.
Claudio Couto is a political scientist at Fundação Getulio Vargas and writes at the Brazilian Report. Claudio, I remember we were together in an event at the University of São Paulo back in July 2017. I had just written this op-ed listing the reasons why I thought Bolsonaro had a realistic shot at the presidency. And I remember you didn't agree with me, at least not at the time. So my first question to you is, when did you change your mind? When did you start seeing Bolsonaro as Brazil's next president?
Well, I think that I first realized in the second semester of 2017, perhaps sometime after our meeting. The sign for me was the rising position of Bolsonaro at the polls. Since Bolsonaro was getting better and better in the voters' intention to vote for him, I considered that it will be a real possibility for Bolsonaro to win the elections in 2018.
And when Bolsonaro wins, what comes to your mind? I mean, what were you expecting?
I was really afraid about the possibility of an administration Bolsonaro to become an authoritarian one, to become an authoritarian government, to challenge the political institutions of the Brazilian democracy in order to destroy them and in order to build an hegemonic administration. And I think that Bolsonaro is really trying to do that. One thing is to try, the other thing is to achieve such a goal. And why that? Because I think that the Brazilian political institutions, they are able to react to Bolsonaro, and at least until now, to resist to Bolsonaro attacks and to Bolsonaro attempts to destroy them, to collapse them.
For those who don't follow the Bolsonaro administration very closely, can you explain why do you say the president constantly challenges democratic institutions?
I think that we have several situations that can be considered together. For example, at the administrative level, in what regards the competences, the capacities of the executive branch, what we see is the Bolsonaro's administration really destroying the capacity of the Brazilian state to have policies that regard pluralism, that regard different perspectives, that regard even the survival of some different cultures inside the Brazilian society and cultures that require the support of the Brazilian administration through public policies. For example, when we see what Bolsonaro makes with the environmental sector in Brazil, well, it's not only an attempt. Bolsonaro is taking from the agencies that are responsible for the environmental fiscalization, for the environmental controls, the capacity to act. They lose authority. Civil servants are removed from their positions because they do their work. They have conversations with people that don't respect the law in what regards environment. and they provide support to these guys. They, in some sense, tell them, well, you can do what you want because you won't be supervised by this administration because things are changing right now. This is just one example. In other cases, the attacks that the Bolsonaro's administration makes against the culture in Brazil. For example, appointing people for agencies that are responsible for arts, for culture, for science, that have nothing to do with the goals, with the mission of those agencies. And for example, you put in an agency that is responsible for protecting the legacy of the African Brazilians, a person who is against the black movement, who is against the legacy of the African Brazilians. And this is an example of what Bolsonaro makes in order to destroy the political institutions in Brazil, and in this case, the institutions that are responsible for implementing public policies and for the continuity of long-term public policies in Brazil. In what regard his relationship with the other branches of government, the legislature and the judiciary, what we see is Bolsonaro and his allies promoting attacks on the streets against these institutions. Bolsonaro resembles to do that, but at the same time, he shows his support to the demonstrations that claim for the changes of justices at the Supreme Court or for their removal, for closing the Congress and things like that. He doesn't have himself directly an action to make this possible, to close the Congress or to remove justices. But what he does is to support openly the demonstrators that require such a kind of action.
Like you said, it has been a very contentious year. What can we expect for the next 3 years? Or better yet, how do you see 2020 shaping up to be?
The political support that Bolsonaro has in the population as a whole now is the lowest political support that the president used to have in Brazil since the polls are performed in his first year. Never a president had such a low support as Bolsonaro have at this moment. On the other hand, it's curious that he has the considerable support and a very resilient support of something about 1/3 of the population. 1/3, 30% of the population that really support Bolsonaro, it doesn't matter what. But what I see is that the image of Brazil is the worst we had perhaps in decades. I even don't believe that we ever had such a bad perspective from outside when people look at Brazil, and we are becoming a kind of pariahs at the international environment. And inside the country, at domestic policy, when we look at the relationship between the executive branch and the Congress, what I see is the worst performance of a president in years in Brazil. What is the best indicator to show that? When you look at the provisional measures, that is the decrees that when enacted have immediate effect as laws. In this administration, we see a number of provisional measures that expire that we have never seen during Brazilian administrations.
Claudio, you are a professor, so I will ask you to grade the Bolsonaro administration. Does it get a pass mark?
It depends on the matter, but I believe that as a whole, I would grade this administration with a 0, because I think that they deserve a 0. Perhaps in terms of final results, in terms of, for example, passing some irrelevant bills like the pension system reform, perhaps he would receive a better grade. But this is only one point, and a point that has much more to do with the behavior of the Congress and the intention of the Congress to pass some policies that are congruent with the Congress intentions, with the majority of the Congress intentions, than with the capacity of this administration to obtain political support from the Congress to its own policies. And this is why I believe that, considering the whole job, what we have is an administration that deserves a 0.
Claudio, thank you very much. If you want more information about how the Bolsonaro administration finished its first year, go to Brazilian.report and download our free of charge ebook. The ebook is split into 4 sections: politics, economics, foreign affairs, and the environment. And of course, for the best content about Brazil in English, subscribe to Brazilian.report. We get a lot of people saying they love our podcast, and the best way to support this show is by subscribing to our website, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Just go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. And this is our last episode of 2019. Thanks for sticking with us for the whole year long. We're taking some well-deserved vacations, but don't worry, our website will continue with daily exclusive content about Brazil. So, happy holidays from the Brazilian Report's newsroom. We'll see you in 2020. Cheers.